Welcome to the biggest corporate celebration of the year! Tonight, one promotion would destroy a marriage and change.
Some people spend their lives chasing success, and some people only hold successful people back. Our marriage ends tonight. Congratulations on choosing the future.
I hope you find everything you're looking for.
The rooftop erupted into applause. More than 1,500 executives, corporate directors, real estate billionaires, politicians, and television reporters filled Chicago's most luxurious rooftop venue. Tonight wasn't just another corporate celebration. It was Olivia Brooks' promotion party. The woman everyone believed was about to become the youngest executive vice president in Vaughn Urban Development's history. Standing beneath the city lights, Olivia accepted the microphone. She smiled confidently, then looked directly at one man standing quietly near the back. Her husband, Calvin Brooks. She smiled, not lovingly, mockingly. "Some people spend their lives chasing success," she said, "and some people spend their lives holding successful people back." Laughter echoed across the rooftop. Calvin didn't move. Olivia reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a leather folder. Divorce papers, prepared weeks earlier. She walked through the crowd, stopped directly in front of him, and placed them into his hands. "Our marriage ends tonight." Thunderous applause followed. Richard Vaughn, the billionaire CEO, wrapped an arm around Olivia's shoulder and smiled proudly. "Congratulations on choosing the future." More cameras flashed. More people applauded. Calvin quietly looked down at the papers, signed the final page, closed the folder, then his phone vibrated. One secure notification appeared. Property control transfer complete. All executive lease authority activated. Calvin locked the screen and smiled, because nobody on that rooftop, not Olivia, not Richard Vaughn, not the board, realized that the company celebrating her promotion no longer owned the buildings they were standing in. And in less than 5 minutes, the woman who had publicly divorced him would discover she had just humiliated the only man who could decide whether her company's doors would open tomorrow morning. 24 hours earlier, Calvin Brooks wasn't getting ready for a rooftop celebration. He wasn't thinking about divorce, and he certainly wasn't expecting to become the biggest story on tomorrow night's news. He was standing inside a renovated warehouse on the south side of Chicago. From the outside, the building looked forgotten. Old brick walls, rusted loading docks, a faded steel sign. Most people drove past without giving it a second glance. But inside, everything was different. Architectural models covered long tables. Digital blueprints stretched across giant interactive displays. Urban planners studied neighborhood redevelopment maps. Financial analysts reviewed commercial lease portfolios. Construction managers discussed affordable housing projects. The entire building buzzed with quiet purpose. As Calvin walked through the room, employees smiled warmly. "Morning, Mr. Brooks." He smiled back. "Morning." No security guards. No luxury office. No executive assistants following him. Just genuine respect. One young architect hurried over carrying a rolled blueprint. "Mr. Brooks, we finally finished the South Harbor redevelopment design." Calvin unrolled the plans across a conference table. Hundreds of affordable apartments, community parks, small business storefronts, a public library. He studied every detail carefully, then looked up. "Move the playground." The architect blinked. "Sir, the afternoon sun hits this side. The children deserve shade." The architect smiled. "I'll change it." Around the room, several employees exchanged smiles. That was Calvin. He never built buildings. He built neighborhoods. Across the office, a television suddenly switched to live business news. The anchor smiled confidently. "Tomorrow night, Vaughn Urban Development will celebrate the promotion of Olivia Brooks during its annual executive leadership reception." The screen changed. Olivia appeared beside Richard Vaughn, standing on the rooftop terrace of the company's headquarters. Laughing together, The reporter continued. Industry experts believe Olivia Brooks is expected to become executive vice president during tomorrow night's ceremony. The room quietly fell silent. No one looked toward Calvin. But everyone knew. Olivia wasn't just another executive. She was Calvin's wife. One employee slowly reached for the television remote. Calvin quietly stopped him. No, leave it. The room remained silent. Olivia continued smiling on the television. Richard stood beside her with one hand resting comfortably on the railing. They looked like they already owned the future. Calvin watched for another few seconds, then calmly switched the television off himself. Back to work. Everyone immediately returned to their desks. His phone vibrated. Olivia, he answered. Hey, her voice sounded hurried. Where are you? The office. You promised you'd leave early. I know. I'm finishing the harbor project. A long sigh came through the phone. Calvin, you always choose work over everything else. He looked around the warehouse, at the employees, at the blueprints, at neighborhoods waiting to be rebuilt. I'm choosing people. She laughed softly. No, you're choosing dreams. Richard builds reality. Our announcement happens at 9:16. A long silence followed. Then Margaret quietly added, by then. Those words lingered in the silence. Tomorrow, Richard. Again. Lately, every conversation seemed to end with his name. Calvin finally asked, are you excited about tomorrow? Her voice immediately changed. I've worked 10 years for this promotion. It's the biggest night of my career. I'll be there. You always say that. Before he could answer, she ended the call. Calvin slowly lowered the phone. For a long moment, he simply stared through the warehouse windows toward downtown Chicago. One project manager approached carefully. Everything okay? Calvin forced a small smile. It will be. Would it? He honestly didn't know anymore. That afternoon, Calvin drove across downtown Chicago. Not toward a luxury shopping district. Not toward a designer boutique. Instead, he parked outside an old neighborhood cafe. The owner, Mrs. Henderson, had known him since he was 22. She smiled as he walked inside. Mr. Brooks. The usual? He nodded. And 2 extra pies. She laughed. For the shelter again? Yes. 20 minutes later, Calvin personally delivered the food to a nearby family shelter. Children ran through the dining hall laughing. Volunteers waved. One little girl recognized him immediately. Mr. Brooks. You came back. Calvin smiled. I promised I would. She proudly showed him a drawing. A tall apartment building. Trees. Families. Dogs playing in a park. My future house, she said proudly. Calvin looked at the picture carefully, then smiled. It's beautiful. The little girl looked up. Will you really build houses like this someday? Calvin gently nodded. I'll do my best. An elderly volunteer quietly whispered to another. Most billionaires donate money. He gives time. Calvin overheard. He simply smiled. Recognition had never interested him. Helping people did. As evening approached, he finally drove home. Their modern lakefront house overlooked Lake Michigan. Glass walls, beautiful architecture, expensive cars. Everything looked perfect. But for months, the house hadn't felt like home. Inside, luxury garment bags covered the dining room. Designer shoes lined the hallway. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Professional stylists hurried upstairs. Photographers discussed tomorrow night's lighting. Event planners carried guest lists. The promotion party had already taken over the house. No one greeted Calvin. No one even noticed he had arrived. He quietly carried the shelter's empty food containers toward the kitchen, then heard laughter upstairs. Olivia, Richard Vaughn, and several executives, laughing together. Calvin stopped, not because he was jealous, because he couldn't remember the last time Olivia laughed like that with him. He quietly placed the containers in the sink, looked around the empty kitchen, and for the very first time, a single question entered his mind. Had he already lost his marriage? Long before tomorrow night's celebration, that evening, Calvin quietly walked upstairs. Olivia stood in front of a full-length mirror. Stylists adjusted her emerald green evening gown. A makeup artist packed away expensive cosmetics. Designer shoes, diamond jewelry, luxury handbags covered almost every corner of the bedroom. She glanced toward Calvin. "You finally made it home." He smiled faintly. "I said I would." She dismissed the stylists with a small wave. As soon as they left, the room became silent. Olivia folded her arms. "Did you buy a tuxedo?" Calvin calmly unzipped his garment bag. A simple navy blue suit, perfectly pressed. Classic. No designer label. No flashy logo. Olivia stared at it. "You can't be serious." "It fits," he answered quietly. She shook her head. "Tomorrow isn't some neighborhood fundraiser. It's the biggest corporate event of my life. Everyone there wears custom suits." Calvin smiled. "I'd rather wear something comfortable." She looked frustrated. "You don't understand. It's about image. It's about first impressions." He looked at her calmly. "I thought it was about character." She laughed softly. "Character doesn't impress billionaires." Those words stayed in the room long after she stopped speaking. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Finally, Calvin asked quietly, "When did appearances become more important than people?" Olivia picked up her diamond earrings. "When I realized appearances open doors." Calvin looked away. Maybe that was where they had started living different lives. Before he could answer, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He stepped onto the balcony before answering. "This is Calvin." A calm, elderly voice replied. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks." Calvin smiled immediately. "Good evening, Miss Sinclair." Margaret Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Holdings, one of America's most respected real estate investors. Her voice remained calm. "The legal team finished everything. The transfer documents are ready." Calvin looked toward the Chicago skyline. "Everything stays confidential?" "Until tomorrow night," she answered. "Exactly as you requested." Calvin nodded. "Good." Margaret paused before speaking again. "I reviewed tomorrow's event schedule. Your wife's promotion ceremony happens at exactly 9:15. Calvin frowned. "I know," she continued. "Everyone in that room will know who really controls Von Urban Development." Calvin slowly closed his eyes. "I never wanted to embarrass anyone." "I know," Margaret replied. "But truth has a way of arriving at inconvenient moments." After ending the call, Calvin remained standing on the balcony. The lights of downtown Chicago reflected across Lake Michigan. Tomorrow night, nothing would ever be the same. Inside, Olivia walked downstairs carrying presentation notes. Her phone suddenly rang. A bright smile appeared on her face. "Richard," she answered immediately. "Everything ready?" Calvin couldn't hear Richard's voice, but he could hear Olivia laughing. Again, she hadn't laughed like that with him in months. After a few moments, she ended the call. "Richard says tomorrow changes everything." Calvin nodded politely. "I'm sure it will." She smiled confidently. "After tomorrow, my career finally begins." Calvin looked at her. "I hope it makes you happy." She hesitated for only a second. "It already does." Late that night, after Olivia fell asleep, Calvin quietly walked into his home office. He opened an old wooden drawer. Inside lay a faded photograph. Their first apartment. No luxury, no designer clothes, no expensive jewelry. Just two young people, holding each other, believing they could build a life together. He smiled sadly. Back then, Olivia used to say, "I don't care if we're rich. I just want us to dream together." Calvin gently placed the photograph back into the drawer, then opened another folder. Inside were confidential documents from Sinclair Holdings, commercial property deeds, board resolutions, voting agreements. Every signature had already been completed. Tomorrow morning, one final signature would quietly place the future of Von Urban Development into his hands. Outside, Rain began falling across Chicago, and somewhere beyond the city lights, the rooftop where Olivia expected the greatest night of her career was already waiting for a truth no one saw coming. The following evening, Chicago's skyline glowed beneath thousands of city lights. The rooftop of the prestigious Harbor Crown Hotel had never looked more breathtaking. Glass walls overlooked Lake Michigan. Elegant fountains reflected the skyline. A live jazz band performed beneath crystal lights. More than 1,500 executives, billionaire developers, investment bankers, politicians, media personalities, and television reporters filled the luxurious rooftop. Tonight wasn't simply a promotion party. It was one of the most anticipated corporate celebrations in Chicago. Outside, a black luxury sedan quietly stopped at the entrance. The driver opened the rear door. Calvin Brooks stepped out. He wore the same simple navy blue suit. No designer logo, no luxury watch, no expensive cufflinks, just polished shoes, a white shirt, and quiet confidence. Several reporters immediately recognized him. "Mr. Brooks, are you proud of your wife's promotion?" Another shouted, "Will you be joining Mrs. Brooks on stage tonight?" Calvin smiled politely. "I'm here to support my wife. Nothing more, nothing less." He quietly walked inside. Across the rooftop, Olivia stood surrounded by executives. Her emerald green evening gown shimmered beneath the lights. Diamond earrings sparkled. She looked every bit like a future executive vice president. Richard Vaughn stood confidently beside her. He smiled. "Everything ready?" Olivia nodded. "The board is here. The investors are here. The media is broadcasting live." Richard adjusted his jacket. "And Calvin?" She glanced toward the entrance. "He'll finally understand. That ambition always wins." Richard laughed softly. "Tonight, everyone discovers who belongs at the top." Neither of them noticed Margaret Sinclair quietly arriving through the private executive entrance. No television crew followed her. No photographers rushed over. Yet, almost every board member immediately stood. One director whispered, "Margaret Sinclair?" Another looked confused. "She never attends corporate parties." Margaret simply smiled, then quietly took a seat near the back of the rooftop. Watching, waiting, the evening began beautifully. Champagne glasses touched. Business conversations filled the air. Executives exchanged congratulations. Photographers moved from table to table. To everyone else, everything looked perfect. Only two people knew. The night was about to change forever. An hour later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate excellence." Thunderous applause echoed across the rooftop. Richard smiled confidently. Olivia proudly stood beside him. The host continued, "Please welcome our newest executive vice president, Olivia Brooks." The applause became even louder. Television cameras focused on the stage. Olivia gracefully walked toward the microphone. She smiled. "Thank you. This promotion represents years of sacrifice, years of hard work, and finally, choosing the future over the past." Her eyes slowly found Calvin, standing quietly near the back. Her smile changed. "This evening isn't only about my promotion. It's also about leaving behind what no longer belongs in your future." The rooftop slowly became silent. Calvin never looked away. Olivia stepped down from the stage, walked calmly through the crowd, stopped directly in front of him, then reached into her designer handbag, a black leather folder. She handed it to him. Divorce papers, already signed, prepared weeks earlier. A wave of whispers spread across the rooftop. Reporters immediately raised their cameras. Richard slowly walked over, standing proudly beside Olivia. She looked directly into Calvin's eyes. "Our marriage ended long before tonight. You just refused to admit it." The rooftop became completely silent. Every guest watched. Every camera recorded. Richard smiled confidently. "Some people build companies. Others only hold dreamers back. Several executives quietly applauded. One investor whispered, "Poor guy." Another laughed softly. He never belonged in this world. Calvin calmly opened the folder. He carefully read every page. Then, without hesitation, he signed, closed the folder, and handed it back. No anger, no argument, no tears. Olivia blinked. That wasn't the reaction she expected. Richard frowned. Something suddenly felt different. Calvin looked at Olivia. His voice remained calm. "I hope you find everything you're looking for." She smiled confidently. "I already have." The audience believed the story was over. It wasn't. Not even close. At that exact moment, Calvin's phone vibrated. A secure notification appeared. Property ownership transfer complete. Executive lease authority activated. He quietly looked at the screen, locked his phone, placed it back into his pocket. No one noticed, except one person, Margaret Sinclair. From across the rooftop, the elderly billionaire smiled, very slightly. Then, she slowly stood. The soft tap of her cane echoed across the silent rooftop. Tap, tap, tap. Every conversation stopped. Every executive turned. Richard's confident smile slowly disappeared, because Margaret wasn't walking toward the stage. She wasn't walking toward the board. She wasn't walking toward Olivia. She was walking directly toward Calvin Brooks. The rooftop became completely silent. Margaret Sinclair slowly walked toward Calvin. Her polished wooden cane echoed across the marble floor. Every executive stood. Every board member watched. Richard Vaughn frowned. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Margaret stopped beside Calvin. Then, without saying a word, she extended her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks." Calvin smiled politely. "Good evening, Margaret." Gasps spread across the rooftop. Olivia's face slowly lost its color. Richard forced a nervous smile. "Mrs. Sinclair." What an unexpected surprise. Margaret calmly looked at him. "The surprise isn't mine. It's yours." She turned toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this promotion continues, there is one matter that must legally be addressed." The rooftop became perfectly quiet. Television cameras immediately focused on her. Margaret continued. "For the past 5 years, one investor quietly purchased the commercial properties leased by Vaughn Urban Development. No publicity, no interviews, no headlines. He simply believed that great companies should build great communities." Richard looked confused. "What does that have to do with tonight?" Margaret smiled. "Everything." She accepted a black leather folder from her attorney, then looked toward Calvin. "Mr. Brooks, the floor is yours." Calvin didn't move. He simply nodded. Margaret opened the folder herself. As of 8:15 this morning, every headquarters, every regional office, every executive building leased by Vaughn Urban Development came under the controlling authority of Sinclair Holdings. Richard laughed nervously. "So?" Margaret looked directly at him. "This afternoon, Sinclair Holdings transferred full executive lease authority to Calvin Brooks." Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Olivia stared at Calvin. "No," she whispered. "No. That's impossible." Margaret calmly continued. "Mr. Brooks now controls every executive lease, every renewal, every restructuring agreement, every occupancy approval. And without his signature, this company cannot legally operate inside any of those buildings." The rooftop exploded with whispers. Executives looked at one another. Investors immediately opened their tablets. Reporters rushed toward the stage. Richard grabbed the folder. His eyes moved rapidly across every page. Property deeds, corporate leases, board approvals, legal transfers. Every signature was authentic. Every document carried the same name, Calvin Brooks. Richard's hands began trembling. This can't be happening." Margaret answered calmly. "It already happened. It became legally binding this morning. One board member slowly stood. If Calvin controls the headquarters, he controls the restructuring agreement. Margaret nodded. Correct. Another director looked shocked. Which means tonight's promotion requires his written approval. Correct. Olivia slowly stepped backward. Her voice shook. My promotion. Margaret looked at her kindly. Cannot proceed without Mr. Brooks' authorization. Complete silence. Richard turned toward Calvin. You planned this. Calvin calmly shook his head. No, I planned an investment. You planned humiliation. The words landed harder than any insult. Nobody spoke. The chairman of the board slowly stood, holding another folder. Ladies and gentlemen, following today's emergency board session, the promotion of Olivia Brooks has been suspended. Another wave of shock spread through the rooftop. Richard looked around desperately. No, you can't do this. The chairman answered calmly. We already have. Security officers quietly approached. Professional, respectful. One officer spoke softly. Mr. Vaughn, the board has requested your executive credentials. Richard looked toward the directors. No one defended him. No one spoke. He slowly removed his executive badge, placed it into the officer's hand, then quietly walked away, completely alone. The rooftop that had celebrated him only minutes earlier now watched him disappear into the elevator. Olivia stood frozen. The applause, the cameras, the celebration, everything had vanished. Slowly, she walked toward Calvin. Tears filled her eyes. I thought success meant standing beside the most powerful person in the company. Calvin looked at her quietly. And now, she lowered her head. I was already standing beside him. A long silence followed. She reached into her purse, pulled out their house keys, her wedding ring, and an old photograph. The picture showed two young dreamers standing outside their very first apartment. No money, no luxury, only hope. I should have remembered. Who believed in me first? Calvin gently looked at the photograph, then quietly handed it back. I believe you're sorry. Hope appeared in her eyes. Then he softly added, but trust doesn't return, just because the truth finally does. Her shoulders slowly dropped. She understood. Some chapters only end once. 1 year later, Vaughn Urban Development looked completely different. Calvin never closed a single office. He renewed every lease, protected every employee, expanded affordable housing projects, created grants for minority-owned construction companies, and transformed abandoned buildings into community business centers. Business magazines called it the most remarkable real estate transformation in America. Calvin declined every television interview, every award, every magazine cover. Instead, every Saturday morning, he visited the same neighborhood youth entrepreneurship center. Marcus ran toward him carrying a new business proposal. Mr. Brooks, my company hired its first employee. Calvin smiled proudly. I knew you would. The young boy looked up. My teacher says you own half of downtown Chicago. Calvin laughed softly. Maybe. Then why are you still here every weekend? Calvin looked around. Young entrepreneurs, families, small business owners, dreams becoming reality. Then quietly answered, buildings create businesses, but character creates legacies. Outside, a simple black SUV waited, not for a billionaire, not for a famous investor, but for a humble man who proved that the strongest foundation was never concrete, it was character. The end.